Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 7th edition of the Communication and Thought Conference under the title, The Power of Communication, the Communication of Power. On this first day of the conference, we are honored to have as our keynote speaker one of the leading authorities of the political economy of communication, Robert McChesney, who for years has been offering insightful critical analysis of power, the media, and journalism. I would like to express our gratitude to Professor McChesney for agreeing to offer the keynote lecture at this conference. Thank you, Professor, and welcome. Before introducing Professor McChesney, I would like to thank Professor Juan Carlos Miguel de Bustos from the University of the Basque Country, Professor Isabel Segovia from Complutense University of Madrid, Professor Concha Mateos from Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid, and Professors Antonio Pineda, María Lamuedra, David Montero, Lorena Romero, Rosalba Mancinas, and José Manuel Moreno, all from University of Sevilla. This professor will engage in academic discussion with Professor McChesney after his lecture. We also have a combination of PhD student researchers with us today. The researchers Ana Ortega, Victoria Garcia Prieto, and Gladys Arlet Corona, who will take part in the Q&A session with Professor McChesney. It would be fair to say that Robert McChesney hardly needs an introduction, but I will offer a few words about his career in any case. Robert McChesney has been professor of communication at the University of Illinois and the author of numerous books that contrast critique of power and the media in the United States, notably including Media, Poor Democracy, the problem of the media, USA communication politics in the 21st century. More recent work includes Digital Disconnect, how capitalism is turning the internet against democracy, Blogging the Roof of the 21st Century, Media, Politics, and the Struggle for Post-Capitalist Democracy. Professor McChesney's life and work is notable not only for the critical perspective he takes as an academic, but also for his activism in raising public awareness about the media and its impact on democracy. This is what has led him not only to write books and teach classes, but also to engage with wider audiences about these issues. Between 1993 and 2003, he took part in more than 1,000 radio talk shows, mainly on community and public radio station. This commitment to engaging with the general public reflects his belief that civil society, the public sphere, are essential as a source of other voices outside of the mainstream media that offer only one point of voice. He also hosted the program Media Matter, which ran from 2002 to 2012 on the public radio station Will AM, operated by the University of Illinois. On this program, he interviewed figures who challenged the dominant discourse, such as Noam Chomsky, Norman Solomon, Michael Moore, Amy Goodman, and Naomi Klein. One of the central ideas present in Professor McChesney's work is his concept of post-capitalist democracy. He argues that to make a post-capitalist society a reality in the United States, the country needs to put an end to military spending. A people movement needs to be articulated to create effective institutions that can change the established power structures. In this sense, Professor McChesney suggests that now more than ever, there is a need for a working class anti-neoliberal political party that can act as a counterweight to the establishment. There is also a need for a series of action that can bring about a social transformation in the United States based on government initiatives to provide housing, healthcare, and even food programs for the disadvantaged, in addition to public education, environmental protection, and a publicly operated media system. And it's precisely this idea of recovering public media that Professor McChesney presents in his recent paper titled "To Protect and Extend Democracy, Recreate Local News Media," co-authored with John Nichols, which focuses on the potential of local media and their role in developing and maintaining democracy. This paper will serve as a basis for his lecture today, which is titled, "Does the Collapse of Journalism Fuel the Rise of Fascism?" And so without further ado, I will hand you over to Professor McChesney. Professor?
Muchas gracias. It's an honor to be here, and it's astounding you all speak English so well, and I speak Spanish so poorly. But I guess if you know anything about the United States, you know that's not uncommon. A funny story about that, I studied Spanish throughout school, studied for several years in high school, but they taught Spanish to us like you teach Latin. It's a dead language. I only learned how to read and write it. You never spoke it. So the first time I went to a Spanish-speaking country, I went to Venezuela when I was 17. And so my dad said, okay, they'll go order dinner for us. And the waiter came and talked to us, and I had no idea what he was saying. I could read the menu perfectly. And I said, okay, maybe I've got to work on my Spanish. But unfortunately, after that, I just slowly forgot it because I never used it, because I never spoke it. And today, in the United States, certainly, it is unquestionably the second language. And to live in North and South America, it's really close to the point where it's becoming mandatory. So hopefully the next generation who speaks to you from the United States will speak to you in Spanish. And I'll be the dinosaur. That's my hope. So yeah, it's an honor to be here. I assume you've seen the paper or read it. I'm going to make the assumption that a lot of the questions that will arise from this talk are answered in the paper, because the paper is the result of 15 years, 20 years of working on these issues, and a lot of dialogues with a lot of people, a lot of the frequently asked questions people have, concerns, not insiders, but people when I give the talk to the general public raise issues that I realize have to be answered because they're logical questions, and I can't assume people will just accept whatever I say at face value. So I think if you haven't read the paper yet, you'll find some of the things that you might say, well, wait a second, hopefully are addressed inside the paper. And it's not that long, it's only 20 pages, I think, or 21 pages. So, so let's go right into it then. Does the collapse of journalism fuel the rise of fascism? Well, that's a loaded title. That invites, the obvious question, what is fascism? What do we mean by that? That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I would say the way I use the term fascism, I think is more or less the historically, academically, historic and academic vision of it or use of the term. I see fascism as an explicitly and aggressively anti-democratic capitalist society. But unlike just a pure military dictatorship or dictatorship of some sort in a capitalist society, it's usually based on some sort of popular mobilization, which has strong elements of a populist critique of elites on one hand, as well as a heavy dosage of racism, bigotry, nationalism, and militarism. And I think it depends on the country for how that dosage plays out, what gets emphasized, who are the bad guys, who are the victims. But it's something like that becomes a very important place for the ideology to develop. There's got to be a nationalism, a bigotry, a racism, somewhere in there. And invariably, fascism leads to militarism. It's built into its DNA. And as long as capitalism exists, I think fascism will be a threat if democratic institutions falter. Democracy, to the extent it can be done, humanizes capitalism. And when democracy goes, we get the worst of it, and we get the worst of everything. So that's what the importance of the issue is in my mind. The first era of fascism was the 1930s and 1940s. And that resulted in the most devastating war in human history to defeat it. And it, just by luck, nuclear weaponry didn't begin a year or two earlier. It might have been the end of our species right then as well, but it wasn't. And fortunately, in the United States and most places in the world, Spain too, starting in the 70s, it has been, you know, a dirty word. It has been something you only use in a pejorative sense to criticize someone. It wasn't something that anyone embraced publicly as being a proponent of fascism. And that has now unfortunately changed. We're in a moment now when fascism returned. They might not embrace the term, but they're not running from it either. They're not running away from it at all. And it's a frightening moment. And it's a moment in which our broader capitalist political economy is struggling. Our democratic institutions, especially the United States, but not just the United States, are faltering sharply. So that to look at the United States today and call it a functional democracy is really a stretch. It is not remotely close to being a functional democracy anymore. It's much closer to what we used to think Mexico was like, you know, with its one-party rule and sort of a semi-democracy for all those years. That's the United States today in many respects. It's gotten to that point. And so it's a frightening moment. And I think, unfortunately, the bad news is that if fascism ascends to the same heights it did in the 1930s and 1940s at a global level, I think that's the end of it for us. I mean, frankly, I think environmentally and militarily, the consequences are devastating. Even imagine it's the end. So it's, needless to say, it's a pretty important issue that we face in the world today. And what role does journalism play? Well, the rise of fascism is based on a weakening of democratic institutions and practices. They go hand in hand. It doesn't mean democracy disappears, but it's just it loses its effectiveness, its vitality, its ability to solve problems. And that's where journalism comes in. And this is really elementary political theory, but functional democracy requires a vibrant, healthy journalism to exist. Otherwise, you can't have informed popular participation. That has to have a journalism. And by that type of journalism, I don't just mean getting the facts about what's going on. Here's the story. But journalism plays an even more important role than that. It plays the role of giving people a sense of why things are happening and how they can participate in them, and an ability to gauge different perspectives and see which one lines up with their values and where they see the world going, and then a way to actually do something about it. So you can be an active citizen in your political culture. And without journalism, that becomes much harder to do. So that's what this paper is about, that we have to get back to having journalism. It's absolutely imperative if we're going to have anything remotely close to a society with democratic institutions that can address the great problems we face and maintain and improve our society rather than deteriorate. So what do we mean by journalism exactly? One thing you'll notice in the paper and that you notice in my work, well, it's sometimes I'm glad to define what makes for good journalism and stuff. I don't think that's something for me to prescribe and then some editor goes, well, Bob McChesney says I should be covering this story and that story, and I'm going to say, I think that's ridiculous. I think the way to have a democratic journalism isn't necessarily to have elites saying, hey, this is how it should be done, or professors or anyone else, but rather it should be from the ground up. It should be as democratic as possible. A healthy, vibrant, free press should be competitive, and I think competition doesn't have to be commercial. I think that strip the commercialism out of the competition. It should be competitive, it should be uncensored, and it has to be vibrant enough that new people can enter and people who are not doing the job can get out of the way. So that's what I look for in trying to create a journalism that'll do the job in the United States. In a variant of this, I hopefully would work elsewhere. But my fundamental interest is in the United States. I think the media we're talking about today and going forward will be overwhelmingly digital. It already is, but it will only continue. So when I talk about news media, I'm talking about the content of journalism, not the medium in which it travels necessarily. So that's an important point. So some people think I'm trying to say newsprint or newspapers per se. No, but I'm trying to say the idea of a newsroom covering a community. That it'll be digital, but it won't be on newsprint necessarily. Very little of it will be on paper. The fundamental thing to having a free press, and this is something that's been lost in the United States, is you have to have resources to do it. You need, even if you're online, and that lowers some costs dramatically, distribution and production in particular, you still need human labor. There's no way around that. We're nowhere near having a robot that can do that for us. When we have a robot who can do our journalism for us, might as well have a robot who can lead our lives for us at that point too. We'll be irrelevant also. So you need money for that. And that's really the great catch. How do you get the funding to pay for this sort of journalism system? Where is it going to come from? Now, in the United States, for the last 150 years, since the middle of the 19th century, the idea was that the profit motive would generate a sufficient journalism, and the profits would come primarily from advertisers. Advertisers would be interested in reaching a target audience, and they would have to buy ads in newspapers to reach their target audience. And the cost of those ads would cover the cost of journalism. They'd pay for the reporters, the editors, and all the other labor expenses. And now in the United States, I should say, advertising usually is about 2/3 of the revenue of newspapers, subscriptions the other. But advertising is the secret sauce that makes the system happen. If you take that away, it's not a profitable industry, period. For general circulation news, maybe for elite news, you can charge enough for it. But for general circulation news, you have to have advertising to make it functionally profitable. And so this is where the crisis really hits the fan, because starting about 25 years ago with the emergence of the internet, but really accelerating around 2005 with the emergence of social media and broadband, the traditional journalism business model in the United States, and to certain degrees everywhere else that has it, began to be challenged because advertisers found they could go online and spend a lot less money to reach their target audience. They didn't have to bankroll content. And they found that if they went to Google or Yahoo or Microsoft or someplace like that, these companies could tell them exactly where their target audience was online. And wherever they were, could find them and give them an ad. And so why wouldn't you do that instead of paying for ads in a newspaper where most people read the ad, don't even want to pay product in the first place? It made perfect sense to shift. And that's exactly what's taken place. So there's been a wholesale shift out of traditional journalism for advertising into the internet. That's where the money's gone. And as a result, we've seen a decline in journalism in the United States that is astonishing, just absolutely astonishing. And you saw the numbers, I hope, in the paper about the decline of revenues for local journalism over the last 75 years or something. It used to be 1% of GDP was accounted for by newspaper journalism, daily newspapers, revenue, and from advertising and from circulation. 1% of GDP. That means $1 out of 100 in the economy was journalism, local journalism. That's what a huge institution it was in this country, especially at the local level. Now it's less than 1/10 of 1%. I think it'll probably be like this year when the final data comes in, it's going to be about 0.8 of 1%. So that's 1/12 of what it was a generation ago. I mean, it's free fall collapse. If you go to the United States today, there's something that maybe you've heard this term now, it's called a news desert. It's sort of a place where you have a place on the map where there is no working journalists at all covering that area, that county, that community. So there's no reporting. You're living in, you might as well be blindfolded in public life in that community. Those didn't exist anywhere in the United States for most of our history. Even the smallest town had someone covering it, or a couple of people covering it. In any side town, even of 10 or 15,000 would have a daily newspaper, or maybe two at one point. That's all gone now. That's news deserts. People are basically on their own. Good luck. They have no one's covering their community. And if you expand the idea of news desert to include areas where you've only got one newsroom that's woefully understaffed, then you're covering most of the country. And then you're covering basically the whole country as a news desert. And a place, once again, we never was a news desert in the past. So that's, and what's become also clear and why this is the case is that businesses have given up on journalism. They realize you can't make money doing traditional journalism. So they've abandoned the field, they've sold off. The dynamic force that now owns increasingly almost the majority of American newspapers, what remain of them, are what we call hedge funds. I don't know if that term has made it to Spain yet. It's a term that's usually preceded by fucking when most people use it in the United States if they aren't investors. Because they come in and they buy up these declining newspapers, they strip them for parts, make as much money on the real estate, whatever they can, then they close them down. And that's we're in that stage now for American newspapers where their hedge funds are buying them up to be stripped for parts and closed down. No one views it as a profitable investment. So what do we do? What do we do? Now, some Americans, because they've been so indoctrinated in the idea that a free press means a freedom of someone to get rich publishing a newspaper or doing journalism, will say, well, so you can't get rich doing it, you can't have journalism. That's just too bad. And we just have to fold up our tent and we can't be a democracy. I mean, some people actually will accept that as we're not entitled to have journalism unless a billionaire can make more money off of it, or a rich person, a business can succeed doing it. Fortunately for the United States, the people who started the country didn't think that way. In fact, for the first 100 years of American history, there was an aggressive policy to subsidize, expand, and deepen newspapers and journalism in this country. And I've done a lot of my historical research, not all of it, but a lot of it's been on the period from, say, 1770 to 1860. And what's astonishing, and this paper has a few of the quotes from it, but it's cherry picked. You could write 1,000 pages on this. What's astonishing is how the framers of this country, the founders, across the political spectrum, from the most conservative to the most radical, to Tom Paine, all understood that you had to have a credible institution of journalism, of news media, or the entire system wouldn't work. I mean, it was central to the whole vision of the country. To the point where Jefferson famously said, if I could only have newspapers or I could have, a government, which would I have? I'll take the newspapers, because without the newspaper, you have the newspapers, you can start a government. If you have a government without newspapers, you're cooked. You're never going to have a democracy. And there was no idea until the late 19th century that this is an area of great profitability, that someone get rich. We should just turn it over to investors to invest in. Instead, they put in massive, oh, I love that cat, Anna. Oh, it looks like my cat. I think it looks like it's starving. You better feed it. Just a joke. Those cats always overeat, like me. So at any rate, the founders put in intense subsidies to spawn a press system. The most important one by far, but not the only one, was they created the post office. The whole point of the post office was to distribute newspapers basically either for free or at a heavily subsidized price to encourage newspaper distribution. It was what the federal government did until, except for wars, it's all it did basically for the first 120 years of American history. The federal government was the post office. That's the majority of the employees, the majority of the budget. Huge subsidies, basically distributing any newspaper anywhere in the country virtually for free. It took that cost away to make it easy to start newspapers. It understood having newspapers, which at that initially were closely linked to every political party and political tendency, was the key to having a vibrant democracy. It was a brilliant policy. I write about it a lot elsewhere. I'll leave it there for now, but it worked. But it also was expensive. I actually did with some statisticians and postal historians, we did a calculus using the data from the 1840s to determine what percentage of the GDP does the subsidy of journalism, of newspapers through the post office, what percentage of GDP was that? So how much money would that be today if the federal government as a percentage of GDP did the same subsidy today? And what we determined would be roughly $45 billion in today's amount. It was a huge subsidy built right into the system, such that when you read anything about newspaper economics prior to the 1920s for American history, the postal subsidies built in as just a cornerstone of the economics of newspapers, that this is sort of a given. But that changed, the commercial system came on and people forgot that history. newspaper magnates and publishers like Hearst and Scripps and Pulitzer were happy to say, no, it's my genius as an entrepreneur created the free press, not the government subsidies. Forget that part of the history. And so as the commercial system is dying today, people are left without any way of understanding how to solve the problem because they don't know their actual history in this country, how we created a free press, a credible free press. And that's why, and I think that Aurora put it in her introduction, we have to understand journalism as a public good. It's something society desperately needs and requires, but the market cannot produce in sufficient quantity or quality. Something society desperately needs and requires, but the market will not produce in sufficient quantity or quality. That's exactly how the framers of this country understood it. They said, yeah, we have to do something about this. It's a public policy issue. And I think that's exactly what I try to do in this paper, is approach it from that perspective. In that sense, news media, journalism is just like education, a public good, or even national defense, although I'd rather link it to education than war, especially in this country. So every country is going to approach this issue differently. In the proposal you read, I actually worked on that, got great feedback from people from Scandinavia, from Canada, a wonderful economist from France named Julia Cagé, an Italian economist, who are all interested in the exact same issues. There are people all over the world. Every country is facing something like this, more severe in the United States, but it's a global problem that's being faced. And so we're matching notes, we're sharing ideas. In the United States, my interest was in local news media because of the nature of our history, our tradition. And it's here that you see what happens when you get a society without journalism, this the cluelessness people have about their immediate environment. And in the United States, it's proven deadly. Our national media at its best grew out of local media. It wasn't a top-down system, it was a bottom-up system. So different newspapers around the country teamed up to create Associated Press so they could jointly hire reporters to cover news in Europe or in Washington, D.C. or New York City. And that's probably how it would be again if we had this system I'm putting in place here. Start at the bottom and build up. And that's how you get a good system. Now, the plan that, in short, I'll just repeat the high points of the plan and then I'll get off this. The way it works is the United States has 50 states. I suspect you're familiar with that. Each state's broken up into counties, and counties are bigger than a city, but not that much bigger. So they're usually a county's like 100 square miles or 500 square miles. And it's got villages and towns and cities inside it. And so this system is based on the county system. Every count, you'd set aside a federal budget every year as a percentage of GDP and say, this is the funds that's going to pay for journalism. And then those funds would be allocated on a per capita basis. So the more populous a county is, the larger its budget for the year. And then you'd have an election every 3 years, and qualifying nonprofit groups would get money based on the percentage of the votes they got. People would be given multiple votes. So you get 3 votes, and in heavily populated counties, 4 or 5 votes. Because the last thing we want is 1 winner or 2 winners. We want multiple winners, well paid. We want competition. We want other voices, minority voices to have an opportunity to be heard, minority viewpoints to have an opportunity to be heard. We want a vibrant, healthy, open system. And then these companies, these news media, these nonprofit groups, primarily probably be former journalists or wannabe journalists coming up in some sort of cooperative. They would, everything they produced would be released immediately on the internet and accessible to anyone for free. So the whole idea of the system is you pay people in advance with public money. They don't get any other sorts of money. They aren't selling ads. They aren't raising funds otherwise. And then they use that money to produce content that goes instantly out into the public domain that anyone has access to. So there's no copyright, there's no barbed wire, there's no secret passwords, nothing else. Everyone in the world gets access to it, especially people in the United States who need it desperately. That's the core idea. If you don't like the people doing it, the next election, you can vote for someone else. So you don't like it, you can start your own news medium and enter in the next election. There's a lot of fine print to make that system work, but generally that's the core idea. So let me, since I'm coming from the United States, let's just talk again, return to where we are here in this country now. The United States, the political environment here is very toxic now. It's really a depressing situation. The federal government seems like it's incapable of doing anything, solving problems, and it's very frustrating. And it produces cynicism and apathy and despair. The journalism is not very good. What little journalism we get, because there's not much of it, spoon feeds us what official sources are saying, more or less, doesn't really do what interrogating what official sources are saying as much as good journalism should. And it's not that they're evil necessarily, they just don't have the resources to do it in some cases. We just don't have people who have the time and money to do that sort of work. We've seen in the United States in the last decade an incredible growth in conspiracy theories, and it makes perfect sense. A lot of people are trying to figure out what's going on in the world. There's a lot of stuff going on, and there's no real journalism trying to engage them and say, hey, this is how you can understand it and draw people in. So yeah, QAnon, I don't know if you've heard about these guys. They're really a piece of work. There are some crazy conspiracy theories out there that have wide followings now, and among elected officials too, even. It's the sort of stuff, like Rasputin type stuff you used to read about in history books in the court of the Tsar that's going on here. And this is what happens when you don't have journalism. This is the result of it. So the only way to really defeat fascist tendencies and the downward spiral we're in is to rejuvenate and invigorate democratic institutions and practices. That's the only solution. In the United States, for a very brief period, in the 1940s, our politicians tried to say, what are the lessons of World War II? What are the lessons of this war we were in the process of finishing with Japan and Germany? And probably it was one of the greatest periods of American history, because we had a president then, Franklin Roosevelt, and a vice president, Henry Wallace, who were probably a little more visionary. And they said, what can we do to make sure we never, and the two things they did, and this is not in the papers, in my other works I've written, but what they did is they said, we don't know, fascism isn't some fluky thing that just the Germans or the Japanese or Italians would do. It's something about their national characteristics is effective. We've got fascists right here in this country. We've got people who are more than willing to make this a fascist country, and what are the conditions to give rise to these fascist movements, and how can we get rid of them so they eliminate, so we never have to worry about fascism again? And Franklin Roosevelt thought this so important, our president at the time, that in his State of the Union address in 1944, which is the annual speech he gives to Congress when it opens its session, beamed nationally over radio then, television now. It's one speech that you're supposed to listen to, the president says, devoted it to that topic, because he knew the war. At 1944, we knew the United States, the Allies would win the war. That wasn't in question, but it was going to take a while to finish it. I said, what can we do to prevent fascism ever from coming to this country or returning elsewhere? And he said, what we need to do is give people security in their lives, guaranteed. It's going to sound amazing coming from an American president, but I swear it's the truth. We have to guarantee people jobs at a good income. We have to guarantee them health care, education, housing. If everyone's secure in those things, they'll never fall prey for fascism. And we have to strengthen democratic institutions. That's what FDR said. He said we need a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights in our Constitution to be passed. And if we have that, that will be our safety against ever having fascism in this country. And to the extent it spreads around the world, it will protect us globally. And as you might, if you study it for very long, you realize that coming out of that speech came the International Declaration of Human Rights, UNESCO, which Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, championed in the late 40s. Said, this is what we have to aspire to in every country in the world. So journalism is a big part of that. I mean, there's no way you get from here to there without a news media that draws people into public life as active and productive citizens. So on an optimistic note, I think there's a lot of support for this when people hear about it. On a pessimistic note, we have a very long way to go, and regrettably, we don't have a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McChesney. Now it's time for the academic discussion. So does anyone would like to start? Maybe Juan Carlos Miguel de Bustos?
Yes, Thank you, Aurora. Well, first of all, I thank Robert McChesney and John Nichols because the interesting paper, and to you and the organization, because I find this type of things are very, very interesting, to discuss previous read the paper. I agree with the paper. I find the paper says about the importance of news, about information, but for me it's more interesting speaking about the cultural industries, radio, TV, and so on. The paper speaks about the importance of a wide readership, and I must say that there is a great problem because people don't read newspaper, and especially young people. Then to find a wide readership is for me is very, very difficult. Then first of all, I must say that local news are very important. Is the base of is the core of the article. But I think they exist, news, local news, news in general. They exist in an ecosystem that characterized by overload of information. At the interior of this overload of information coexist fake news and true news that has a lot of problems. This true news too, because the normal news are they have some characteristics, discontinuities. Always they speak about disasters, catastrophes. For the instantaneity is fundamental, and the result of this coexistence between information and disinformation in this overlap of information is one of the explication. Because people don't read news, because they can say which information is true or which information is disinformation. And the mechanism we have, for example, fact checkers are not sufficient. They can't fight the disinformation. For me, this consideration of the overall is very important, very is fundamental, not to explain the actual crisis of journalism and other things. In a research of the Pew Research Center of November 2021 about the future of digital space and their role in democracy, the interview experts said that social media algorithms are the first thing to fix. Then we must consider another factor is that we live in the platforms era, and a lot of people read, live, and things, and do a lot of things in platforms. Then we must consider that people read, or even in the project that the paper presents, people will read some news in the platforms. The paper proposed a local journalism initiative that tries to fix the local journalism sustainability act, because the local journalism sustainability act only using tax credits try to keep and rehire reporters, but well, the paper says that maintain the illusion that for-profit news media are the essence of a free press, and the paper try to find another mechanism, I think very progressive. No? Is the government we must provide the sum of money to provide, no, or to revitalize the local journalism. I find a little problem with this non-profit journalism, because in the competition between non-profit journalism and for-profit journalism, for-profit journalism enterprises or organizations will have more advantage, because they could exploit networks economies, scales economies, or what I call data economies, or in Spanish economy de las masas, ¿no? A word which is the data economies. I have another name, crowd economies, the crowd economies. Then the for-profit enterprise could exploit the knowledge of people who is reading or using the internet, and then they will or they could exploit or put some news according to the thing people want to read. And the other problem is that platforms, I told at the beginning, will take this local news in their own profit, because I have found that Facebook has founded a lot of projects. I have seen that it has raised money to Pulitzer Center, to Report for America, to 9/11 Local News Transformation Fund, to Local Media Association, to Local Media Consortium, American Journalist Project, Community News Project, and so on. Then platforms, Facebook, for example, is very, very interested in promoting this local news. And this is very, very suspect. This interest is very suspect, no? Because the interest of Facebook in journalism is not to improve the quality, but its interest is to continue to feed the people with things that they want to read, and then it continues. Facebook continues to promote and to expand the problems he has created, no, like polarization, echo chamber, problems about privacy, and so on. After to find to revitalize the local journalism, the paper offered the quantity allowed to the LAG, to the Local Journalism Initiative, and it's only $100 per capita. In Europa, in European countries, the percentage give to the public service media are more than that, because the $100 per capita means 15% of GDP, and in European countries, Denmark, for example, give the 4% to the public service media. Then, if we compare with Europa, with Europe, is not a big quantity. But the problem is that in USA, there is no tradition of allowing money to public service broadcasting or public service media. Then I think this could be a great problem. Even in Europe, there is a lot of big problems, because it's very difficult to increase the quantity they give. The government give, or the taxes give to the public service media. There are difficulties for accompanying the budget to inflation, for example. Even the tax or the funds are in danger, because a lot of people think that or consider that there is not necessary to have a public service media today. Then the question is, if it is not better thinking in a more local communication, or even in a public service internet, like in Europe. I mean that a public media in Spain, for example, regional public media, they consider local news, local entertainment, local books, local music, and even in Europe, we can consider some regional activities when there are some laws that consider to have a quota for European programmation, or even in a nation to have quotas to promote the cinema in a nation. Then I think it could be more interesting. And I want to present only briefly the public service internet. There is a manifesto, and the interesting of the public service internet is that it considers the democracy the objective, and this democracy requires a public service media, but transforming this public service media to public service internet. And then we can consider public access, for example, diversity, identity, information, objectivity, pluralism, and this type of things, because we live in the well, in the internet era, well, meaning that we have internet and a lot of people use and consume a lot of time in internet, then we must take this in consideration and promote the platforms, not only against the GAFA, no, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, but using this possibility to promote the democratic values through not only journalism, but I consider the cultural industries, no, books, radio, TV, music, in the relation between local and global. No? It doesn't mean that we must publish only local books, but we must consider local news and local languages, like in Spain. No? Then I think this manifesto of public service internet, I thought that I could find McChesney, but it wasn't. No? There is a lot of people, a lot of academics around the world who has signed this manifesto. It is very easy to find it. No, only public service internet manifesto, and you can find it. And well, this is an idea interesting to take an account. And another question is if we why not to price the GAFAN? No, what the Stiglitz, no, the Nobel laureate, yesterday wrote an article in the Project Syndicate, and he was speaking about we must price externalities like greenhouse gas emission and so on. And my question is, why not to price the negative externalities of platforms like polarization, echo chambers, biased algorithms, and so on, and to promote this, for example, public service internet? Thank you. This is all my contribution.
Well, thank you. You actually gave me, I could do another 45 minutes. You've raised some really very important issues. Let me just take on the two or three that I think jump out as being most important. The question about platform journalism and the public service internet. This is an area, let me, in 2015, I think it was, or 2016, I wrote an article that basically said there are three great issues that we have to deal with in communication going forward in the United States and globally. One of them is the collapse of journalism, which I talked about here. The second is internet access should be ubiquitous and free, and we should get rid of the telephone companies and all these people who are just nothing but organized crime institutes. They don't really produce value. They own government politicians, so they get the right to have a monopoly, like a telephone company. And then we have to pay through our teeth. In America, that's really a problem. We pay the highest prices in the world for internet access for the lousiest service. So there, it's a painful issue, and it's purely parasitic industry. Didn't invent the internet, doesn't do anything. It just charges you money if you want access to it. So I say we have to basically nationalize it, make it a public service internet, access to it, ubiquitous and free at all times, just as a condition of being a citizen. And then the third great issue was we had to deal with the growth of the monopolies on the internet. The big five global companies that are all based out of the United States, Facebook, I guess it goes, now it's called what? It's got a new name. Google has a new name. I like how they changed their name. That's sort of suspicious how they have the Meta and Alphabet. Then of course, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, the big five, who I think last time I looked are the 5 most valuable companies in the world, although Facebook might have fallen off due to its scandals. And I said, we've got to do something. This degree of economic monopoly is totally incompatible with the democratic society. There's not even any debate about that. These guys have to go. I don't know how we do it exactly, but it's got to be an area of study, debate, examination, because we do know if you have 5 companies this size, that's just way too much power that's unaccountable over the crucial aspects of our lives. So those, in my view, were the 3 big issues. Now, I'd like to work on all 3 of them, and I have, but the one that I'm dealing with is journalism in this. And there's a reason why I didn't merge public service internet with journalism, or taking on those monopolies like Google and Facebook, the platforms, and journalism. And the reason was, first of all, I wanted to make it clear on what the issue was about journalism. I didn't want to muddy the waters and have like an omelet suddenly. And secondly, in the United States, those lobbies for those 5 companies now are unbelievably powerful. They get their way no matter what. They can call the president of the United States either party, and he will answer the call from the CEO of any of those 5 companies. He could be in the middle of having sex with his wife, and he's going to say, sorry, honey. And he's going to grab the phone to take Bill Gates's call. No matter what, they have that much power. And I said, if we try to propose a journalism initiative in the United States that takes some of the ideas that are used in Canada or Australia, where they have Google and Facebook pay the cost of journalism to the commercial companies, well, that's like going into a bar and picking a fight with the 3 biggest guys in the bar when you don't even care about them that much. You're not there to take care of those guys. You want to talk to someone in the back of the bar. It's just absurd. You're going to lose politically. It's insanity. That doesn't mean I don't want Google and Facebook to be dealt with. I do, but I don't want that to be the thing that carries this issue. And part of the reason is we don't have a commercial journalism at all in this country, compared to even Spain, I'm sure. Very little commercial journalism. So we don't really have a powerful lobby that opposes this. 10 years ago, if I proposed this, we'd have all these big newspaper publishers and journalism companies opposing this idea as a threat to them. Well, they're all gone now. They're not in business. They're sold out. There's no organized lobby to oppose us. So why go find the most powerful lobby in Washington and declare war on them as part of proposing this? Political suicide. So that's why it doesn't make any sense. That doesn't mean I say, therefore, we should let them do what they do. No, but that's another fight. And having a healthy journalism will make us win that fight or have much more success in getting a public service internet than having the coverage now, which is no journalism. And so it's just, nothing there at all. I will say this also, if Facebook and Google and the other platforms are smart, were this local journalism initiative to pass, they would very wisely elevate it and make it sort of the focal point of the journalism they offer and make it ubiquitous, much like Google search made Wikipedia ubiquitous, because it will take the attention off their editorial judgment. They can say, look, this is the journalism people in this county voted for. That's the most legitimate journalism. We're going to give that top position in all our algorithms, over the conspiracy theory from some unknown whack job. This goes first. The stuff that's identified, you know who's doing it, you know where the money's coming from, you know who the people are, they live there. So in the short term, they actually would benefit. Now, whether they're smart enough to know that, I don't know, but I hope they would. It would be in their interest. They should be wise enough to know their public relations people should explain to them, this is how you avoid getting in hot water in Washington. So, and anywhere else in the world for that matter, but especially Washington in their case. So that's how I've dealt with that. I love the idea of a public service internet. I think it's long overdue. I'm all for it. But I just don't think you can smush these things together in one issue and win. It might make for a good book. Doesn't make for crappy politics if you're trying to actually be successful. And for organizing purposes, then you have to convince people of 2 or 3 fairly different policy issues to get any support on one. I don't know, let's just take one at a time. Let's start with something and deal with it and move forward. Couple other things. The United States, for that reason, the threat against the tension between nonprofit journalism and for-profit journalism, that would have been a big deal 10 years ago. There's so little for-profit journalism left that it's not, especially at the local level. most of the places this would come into place, there's not any commercial journalism to speak of. So it's not like there's your existing newspapers are going to be going nuts at this new competition. They won't. It's just not as it would have been an issue. It isn't anymore. And even if you have the local journalism initiative and it's passed, we would prevent for-profit companies from being involved, except for one exception we mentioned in the paper, temporary exception for firms that are transitioning to becoming nonprofit. We would prevent for-profit companies from being involved because basically we want anyone who get this public money to have no other source of income. We don't want any other strings attached. The money that pays for the journalism comes from the public through these elections. It's allocated. And when you're reading that, you don't have to worry about, someone getting paid under the table or someone buying huge ad buy, and therefore they're going to get coverage that suits them. There's going to be enough money there to pay salaries to have a really credible news media without any other sources of income. And your nonprofit, we want the money to go to journalism, pure and simple. So that's why we do that. But if anyone wants to start a commercial news medium and try to make money, nothing is stopping them. And there will be no competition for advertisers. So basically, we're not getting, this will not hurt someone who wants to make money doing journalism if they can figure out a business model. But if they can't figure out a business model, we still need journalism. We don't have time to waste. Let's see, what else is there? One of the criticisms that you sort of implied, I don't know how much you want to go there, is that some of the groups that might get elected to do this journalism in the local journalism initiative might do lousy journalism. They might do conspiracy theories themselves. Well, that's the way it goes. If they meet the criteria, so they're not fraud, if people want that, they can get that. And that's just that's the price of what happens in a democracy. Some parties win elections you don't like. That doesn't mean, okay, we ban that party. It just means to do a better job of organizing your followers so you can win the next election, as long as you still have elections, of course. And so I think a lot of the concern about fake news and disinformation, which is very legitimate, comes because of the lack of journalism. My sense is that a lot of the worst stuff is driven by people trying to make a buck, fake money. If you could strip it down and get to the bottom of a lot of QAnon and other conspiracy theories and fake news, there's someone who's doing a hustle somewhere at the back of it. It's a grift. And this will, there will be no financial incentive in this because you'll be making a felony if you start grifting off of public money. So I think that the likelihood this would not be attracting the hustler grifter crowd of conspiracy theorists. They'd stay in the private sector and do their own thing without public money. And that's exactly what we want. And then we can look at them in a different light. I could go on, but let's carry on with other folks.
Thank you, Professor McChesney. We will continue with Concha Mateo, for instance. Are you ready, Concha?
Yes, really. Thank you. Thank you. It is exciting to be here, learning from you all, I have to say. Thank you for having me, and congratulations, Aurora, and the rest of the group for organizing this such a interesting panel in focusing such an important and crucial issue that is hitting our societies currently, in the face of which I think it would be unacceptable to remain impassive. So I think we cannot sit on our hands. We have to take action. So thank you so much for having this elected this issue. Thank you so much to Bob for your steering and inspiring and moving lecture. Because in a sense it is a provocation. I think we could name it a provocation, which I consider it's perfect because this problem is so deep that it deserves our farmers and fullest commitment. So I hope it could spark change for the better. What about your paper, about the text you have sent us, I only going to remark three things. And the first one is, I love it because you not only expose a problem, describe it, and support it in data, which is one of the main functions in the academy. But I appreciate so much that you also advance and pose a proposal. You are suggesting us what we could call a plan of action, or in this situation, probably an emergency plan, And I think this is imperative for academy, but it is not so common, at least not in a Spanish academy. No, I appreciate so much that you are proposing a plan. Probably in the course of its develop, it will change, but it is a plan. It is something to act. And academy is not only funded to observation, reflection, research, and collecting data. We have something to do in return to the society. So I appreciate it so much. And the second thing is that I support it entirely. I have no objection, no amendment, no amendation, no critical. But and I appreciate so much little details or nuances that I consider it important. For example, I am going to copy your expression, healthy journalism, because this is an expression that everybody can understand. Common, no, not common people, but non-academic people can understand. Healthy. We used to say well-funded journalism or independent or uncensored, or well, but healthy journalism. You have said we are living in a toxic environment, politically toxic. So healthy is an important goal or challenge for us to take in mind, no? To bear in mind. And there is another important aspect that for me is new. You have inspired me, so I am grateful for this. You say that a powerful local media are the prerequisite for a viable national newspaper system. And this is important for me. This to pose the attention in this interrelated dependence of the system, because we have forgotten the little local, and that drive us to consider the importance of community ties, which are the base of democracy, even the base of the journalist. So I appreciate too much these two ideas. I'm going to copy with your permission. And the third question is, yes, an observation, because I think there is a point that we are not considering sufficiently, probably on my view, you are focusing the attention on the availability of information, but probably it is also a problem not of availability, but usability. How people use information. And I consider this is more difficult to revert. And I am not going to extend more, but I want to remember one thing from classical Greek wise, Thucydides used to say, we have to choose between relaxing or being free. Being free, monitoring media, monitoring government, get informed, is it a hard work? So what are we going to do to move people to that hard work? But thank you so much. It has been a lovely lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. The last point you raised is really an important point. It's not just about availability of information, but it's about usability. And when I got started in studying media, probably the biggest issue I was concerned with, which has always been at the bottom of all my work, was why is the United States such a depoliticized society? And it has been my entire life, meaning why, compared to almost any other country in the world, are Americans singularly uninterested in politics, and uncomfortable discussing politics unless they're maybe drunk and yelling insults or something. But what is it? Why is it a depoliticized society? And I think that gets to the point that I think that in the United States, most people feel alienated from the political process, like they really have no role to play, that what they care about and think really has no effect on what people do in power. And then it's a rational response to become depoliticized. Why invest a lot of energy in learning all about something you have no influence over? Better to study, the soccer standings, and then at least it's something you root for a team and get pleasure from the game by knowing all this information. But why learn about the world if you have the politicians going to do whatever they do independent of what you care about or what you might think? So I said that's a rational point. And my experience has also been that after 50 years of activism, to date myself, that when you see moments of social upsurge, when people get interested in it, say we better do something, then suddenly they do want this information. They say, I need information. Necessity is the mother of invention. And so what we have to do is create a journalism that's there, that will interact, hopefully with an increase of interest, that people will push it. Hey, I want to know about this. I need to know about that. How come the government's doing that? And with that, then you get the sense, hey, we can actually change what the government does. It will respond to our actions. And then journalism, that's what journalism, the role it's supposed to play. And that's the role it had in the United States, not for all Americans, but for a fairly significant percentage of Americans for the first 100 years. I mean, the press was right in the middle of everything. And so on that line, one of the related point that I didn't bring up, it's in the paper, but it's very important for the American situation. This proposal, the value it has, is that in the United States, there's been a tradition of African-American newspapers that going back to before the end of the Civil War, but certainly since the end of the Civil War, all the Black communities in the northern cities and western cities and communities had their own newspapers. They were actually pretty good newspapers. They got some funding, but they were undernourished compared to the dominant papers. The dominant newspapers in the United States that really controlled the landscape of local journalism in the 20th century more or less ignored the Black community entirely. They basically, Blacks weren't, they were there. You had to deal with them, but if they were in the news, they were seen as basically as a problem for white people getting in their way, not as like people who, as agents in their own right. For that, African-Americans had to go to their own newspapers. Well, their own newspapers have been pretty much wiped out because, the advertisers who supported them have jumped ship, just like the advertisers for the mainstream newspapers. So it's been disappeared pretty much. And there's no been increase in coverage of the Black community and what remains of American newspapers and American journalism, because that never was a beat that got a lot of attention. There's so few reporters. Well, this proposal was built with that in mind. One of the things about having 5 winners minimum in every county is that in any county with a significant African-American population, or Latino for that matter, from Central America or South America, we'll probably have enough money to get at least one medium that'll be based in that community or oriented to that community. And that will be a revolution in American politics. If African-Americans in every sizable community, every major city, have at least one news medium that they control, people in their community, and has the funds to pay people to cover their community, that will be, it's difficult to exaggerate what a revolutionary force that would be for democratic practices in the United States. That alone, just that alone.
Next, I would like to invite Antonio Pineda from University of Seville to offer her reflections on Professor McChesney's paper and lecture. Antonio?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thanks again, Robert, for your wonderful address on the paper as well. And I'd like to say that your proposal, your plan is really brave, and I hope it succeeds. My reflection or question has to do with 2 threads that somehow run throughout the whole paper, which are, on the one hand, propaganda. We might speak about fake news or disinformation or whatever, but it is propaganda that what we are talking here actually. And on the other hand, this neo-fascist ultra-right threat to democracy, and actually neither of them are new phenomena. As far as I know, in the US there is some historical iteration of far-right movements, like the John Birch Society in the 1950s, or the Tea Party in 2009, and this and the other. But my question is regarding propaganda and the far right, which are really, which are very, very connected. Do you think that there is something new about this today? Do you think those phenomena are undergoing changes, and therefore they are becoming more dangerous for democracy?
Boy, yes, is the answer to your second question. Absolutely. And you know, we talked about this before the formal lecture. I mean, if I had titled a paper, "Is the collapse of journalism fuel the rise of fascism?" 10 years ago, people would have dismissed me as like a whack job. It's like, who is this guy? Fascism? What is he calling just some conservative Republican a fascist? What sort of crazy rhetoric is this about? So I think that just the fact that I'm using the term fascism, we're using it casually to describe phenomena politically, tells us we're in very different terrain than we were before. And that's very treacherous terrain, in my opinion. In the United States, it's to give some sense of the change that's taken place. You know, on January 6th, a bunch of Trump supporters tried to stop Congress from ratifying the last election. And, you know, this is basically, this is unbelievable. I mean, again, if 10 years ago someone said this would happen, you would say that's impossible. It'd be unthinkable in any condition. And so that now is just like ho hum. You know, there's another day at the beach in America. There's more of it coming. There's been really no penalty to pay for that yet. And if there isn't a severe penalty to pay, even if there is, this is coming back. It's not going away. The pressures that led to this have not dissipated. If anything, they've intensified. And the thing about the propaganda that's so striking with that movement in particular is that even though there's absolutely not a scintilla of evidence this election was stolen, and even the Republicans who've examined it said, you know, there's nothing here. This was a legitimate election. Even though that's just the fact that it's asserted is sufficient to be sufficient evidence for millions and millions of Americans that to this day believe it was a stolen election. Now, it's a completely moronic argument, because if in fact you doctor the ballots, then how come Republicans did very well in all the other races on the exact same ballot? You know, they just doctored some and not others. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. It didn't make any sense at all. It didn't fly. But the concern here is that 20 years ago, there might have been people who thought like this, or 40 years ago, the John Birch Society, which is our notorious anti-communist group in the 1950s and 60s. But it was a fringe thing, and evidence like that would have been enough to dismiss it forever as lunacy. Now it has a half-life. It's going to go on, that they're going to keep building out. There's a lot of reasons for that, the political situation in the United States. But, and this gets back to my paper, not having a journalism that people regard as credible, that you can point to, that studies this, that people have access to, is hurts. Because then, hey, what I see on the internet's as good as what someone else sees on their part of the internet. And it confirms what I want to think and what my politicians are telling me. That's all I need to know. Anything else is fake news. That's the environment we're in. And that, I don't think we've yet to see a case where that can produce a successful system of democratic governance. I don't think you can. I think that's what we have to address.
Thank you. Now we will listen to Ana Isabel Segovia from Complutense University of Madrid.
Hello, thank you for having me. As well, all the formalities that the previous speakers have talked about. I think it's very interesting, this discussion, and some of the things I was going to mention are already on said. I think that it's important to have in mind that our contexts are very different, and that I think, Bob, I wanted to congratulate you and Victor, or Ben, for the project. I think that it's planned with detail and ingrained in the US context, no? And because of that, some aspects are a little weird from a European perspective, no? Because we have already a public media system that puts money on public media regularly, and even I think that this media system has delayed the commercialization and spectacularization of news in Spain, but in the end has arrived, is here, and audiences follow this trend, no? So I would like to focus on two things, no? First, if you think that we can gain the audience back, the public back to this healthy journalism, that I think it's something that worries me a lot, because I feel that the problem in the end is to access different points of view, because we are used now to feed on polarized information, and we live in these echo chambers and information bubbles, where not only the opinion but the facts are different, no? In this post-truth world. So I think that one fundamental question, and it's some of the things that you mentioned also in the paper, no, that is when you mentioned some other articles and studies, like when in the US the local papers disappear, you are losing more than news. No, you are losing a public space in which debate and discuss public issues. So I think that it's important to have in mind that we need a space where we can establish and discuss public issues with a common ground. So my idea to your proposal would be if when you choose the applicants, if is not useful to add in that local journalist initiative to regain the fairness doctrine a little, no? This obligation that was in the United States till the 80s, that when you cover a public interest issue, you have to give different points of view. So to put that also as a prerequisite no, to gain the funds to operate. I think that it's important now, and as I said, it's something that is always on my mind, and not only that the data and the information is there, but that the people want to know about it or can access it more easily, and not only feeding information from those so different point of views that I think are destroying also our democratic societies.
Great points, Anna. Let's talk about public media for a second, because that's been brought up before too. The United States probably has among the least well-financed and least successful public media
I know.
in the world, both radio and television. Although ironically, because commercial journalism and programming has faltered so badly on radio, the NPR system has come to play a much larger role. It hasn't grown, it's just still standing while everything else has fallen off. So it has much more of a role in the United States than it probably did 30 or 40 years ago, 25 years ago. You know, my wife's Norwegian. I'm in Norway twice a year, several months a year now. And my Norwegian's no better than my Spanish, unfortunately. But Norwegians all speak English, fortunately, too, better than I do often. And you know, their public radio and television system is really probably as fine per capita as any in the world. And they actually have local stations with local reporters covering the country. And I know Sweden has a similar system as well, which the United States doesn't have. Our local NPR's affiliates, radio stations and television stations sometimes have local news, but it's usually just one person reading the headlines from the morning paper. The print journalists would traditionally provide the news, and they would just sort of regurgitate it. Most of the journalism done in public broadcasting is out of the Washington, D.C. national office, covering the same stories as the national media. And that's why one of the things we hope to do with this local journalism initiative is let the public radio and television stations apply for funds if they kind of set up units that just do local journalism. So all the money goes to produce content locally, then they can participate in it as far as we're concerned. But right now they're not players. And it is a reason to be why we can't have the same reliance on public media, say Norwegians would have by comparison, or Japanese people for that matter, a number of countries. At the same time, I wouldn't think just expanding the budget to public broadcasting in the United States is a solution, because what I like about the local journalism initiative and what I think makes it popular with Americans and gives it a chance for success is it doesn't say who's going to be doing the journalism or what's going to be called good journalism. It leaves that to the journalists to apply, or to the people that apply, and to the people who vote. And they will determine what it becomes. And that's how it should be. If I try to prescribe, well, I think these guys are doing a good job, let's make sure they get money. Well, then along is going to come Donald Trump and say, well, I think they're doing a crappy job. Give it to my friends over here from QAnon. Well, then we're nowhere. That's not going to work. We have to basically trust, you know, we have to work on the founding assumption that we can trust people to govern their own lives. And if we can't, it's over anyway. So let's just try that assumption in the first place and see how that works. I'm confident it will work really well. Let's say we have elections in a city. Local journalism initiative came into effect in a city like Cleveland, Ohio, where I was raised. A city of, the county is probably 1.5 million people. It's an great old industrial city. One time very rich. Now it's the poorest city in the country, but the suburbs are very wealthy around Cleveland. Unlike most American cities, if you've been to the United States, you know what I'm talking about. What if they had the local journalism initiative? Well, you probably have, say, 6 or 7 that will qualify, that will get sufficient funds to exist, maybe more. And of that 6 and 7, you probably would have, I'm guessing, 2 or 3 that would say, hey, we're professional journalists. We used to work for the newspaper. Now we're setting up this company. We're cooperating, we're just cover the community, you know what we're doing. They would get funded. And their politics would be either not explicitly stated or they'd be relatively mainstream. But they wouldn't be left or right particularly. You'd probably have one, definitely would have an African-American medium. His politics would probably run left because that's a very progressive community in the United States. You might have a Trumpian type sort of people getting about doing what's seen as conservative. You might have some other type of conservatives. You'd have a range, in other words, almost certainly because of the nature of the way it's set up. And I think, let's see how that goes. I mean, I'd like to see, let's just give people the funds to do it and let's see what happens, because I think good things can come out of that. I think you could get a dialogue. I think you get experimentation. I think things would emerge we can't anticipate in advance that would be very positive, and maybe some negative ones that you'd have to address. But I mean, you got to leave it to people to make their own decisions in something like this. I just don't think you can prescribe it in advance. If you do, it's not going to get through, and I don't know who does the prescribing. This way, it's the work of the people, and actually the people doing the journalism and the people consuming the journalism have all the power.
Okay.
Sorry, I think I have some technical problems. I had to solve it. Okay, we will continue with David Montero from the University of Seville. Are you ready, David?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you to Bob as well for the article, for the lecture, and for the proposal itself. I think it's very interesting always to see academic work that ends up in a proposition, a political proposition, which is, you know, in a time of emergency, as he has been outlining. I think it's very important to propose things, to propose some kind of action. And I think there is a pretty specific call to action with this initiative, and it's something that we should certainly celebrate. I think as well that, you know, on a more personal note, I think I have to celebrate the fact that it's not focused on social media, because sometimes we tend to over-focus on social media. And I'm certainly reading a lot about social media, and there are mentions to social media, but the idea of bringing back local journalism, I think it's very important in relation, as he was explaining, to the ascent of fascism, not only in the US, but rather sadly also here in Europe. So quite ironically, I myself couldn't stop thinking about social media while I was reading the paper, and how, you know, how these things would interact, because it's not that local journalism, I think, has completely disappeared, but some parts of it have been replaced by social media dynamics that I think that, you know, they don't add up to journalism itself, but are somehow replacing good journalism. And it made me think about the idea of, you know, is rather what we understand as information, what is changing, as well as the whole company landscape and economic landscape is changing around journalism. I mean, young people, are they interested in good journalism? Or what do they think? Do they think that being constantly updated about something, it's actually being informed? Because I tend to think that they feel that, you know, they need constant updating of information, and some of them believe that that's actually being informed. Yeah. And local media are actually, or general media are actually copying social media dynamics in this idea of we need to keep you updated, and we invest our resources in keeping you updated all the time, rather than actually, you know, investing in journalism. So the idea was it made me think about these two, one very obvious, I think, and very well addressed in the paper, which is the idea that local media is certainly disappearing, and we need to provide local media journalism, and the author has to be there. And then there was the cultural side of it, as saying, you know, is people really going to buy into it? Are they really going to read it, or are they going to demand just, you know, being updated? And it made me think about the educational side of this. I mean, is this, it doesn't make sense to think about an educational side to it. I mean, at least here in Spain, students in primary, secondary education, they don't get any media education at all. They just, you know, they don't really understand how important journalism is for the whole of the democratic system, as you outlined as well in the paper. So I was thinking about this educational side. Is it something that you have considered? Is it something that comes up when you talk about the initiative? Is it something that would it be worth bearing in mind as well in terms of the importance of the initiative itself? And also, and I think it's going to be very brief in here because you have addressed some of these concerns, but do you think that in the toxic political landscape that you have referred to, well, while you were speaking in the US in particular, but again, in Europe as well, do you think that initiatives such as these are going to be welcomed? Are we going to, can we rely on politicians? Can we rely on them on passing laws that are going to end up providing more means of citizen control of their action? Or at least in Spain, they're resisting the kind of, you know, they're kind of fixated on media and on controlling the media, and either through private companies or even public media, we have problems of political interference with public media. So it was these two things, the education thing and also whether you think this is going to be somehow welcomed at the political level. And thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the great comments and great questions. One thing that's really interesting, an earlier draft of the local journalism initiative, and again, I'm working with maybe a half dozen people on this who give me really good feedback. And as I said, a couple of them aren't American, even though, because they're concerned for their, you know, France and Italy have their issues as well. But one of the initial versions took, like, I forget what percentage, 10% of the money, and said this should go entirely to student media. So basically every high school, every middle school has funds for a teacher and resources so that the kids can do that's an American, young people, students can start doing what I was able to do in 7th grade, work on my school newspaper and become a writer, an editor, and all my friends were, you know, through to college. And those have pretty much disappeared in the United States now. And it doesn't have to be in print. Again, it can be online, but it's the process of creating something and having the resources to do it. Because I think you're right, I think this is not exactly what you're asking, but it's an issue that when the research shows, and my anecdotally can see, when people stop trying to be creators of journalism, just consumers, you miss something in the process. That when young people actually write a story, you learn something about how that process works. We do a lot, and it's important, it's valuable experience. And so we've lost a generation now that doesn't have that experience. And it means that, you know, when press issues come along, you've only taken it from the perspective of consuming a headline on social media. It's a different world than if you're behind there putting the story up on another side, and what that process is. So we think getting people doing it at an early age was part of this process too. It really encouraged that. So then when they came of age, you're 22, a bunch of friends get together, say, hey, in the last election, let's put our policy group together and try to get some funding so we can do this in Cleveland or Detroit or wherever you might be. And I'm still a fan of that idea, but it just made the issue was too complicated. And it's hard enough to do what we've done to add in that leg, but I do think it's important. I think we have to really encourage people at a very early point to be producers, not just consumers of making content. I've always thought the social media end of it, if the local journalism initiative worked, it would come in to then play a dominant role in social media. It would be the stuff people would link to, they'd talk about, they'd share. It would move pretty quickly in that area. Because if this came through, I mean, the resources are really intense. We're talking about really a well-funded media. This is the caliber of funding American journalism had in its golden age. There are going to be a lot of people getting paid decent salaries to cover their communities. They're going to be producing a lot of content. So some of it's going to filter through, if not a lot of it. So hopefully that would happen. Now, there might be other issues with social media that go back to dealing with platforms and the like, dealing with their usage of advertising to exploit it. And those have to be sorted out. I can't sort them out yet, but I agree that those are on the horizon that we'll have to deal with. As for politicians, well, I'll just say one thing. My experience, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, I was very active in the Bernie Sanders campaigns as an advisor to Bernie. I leafleted for him, I was on the ground both years. And, you know, I was a speechwriter for him once 20 years ago on media issues. He's a good man, a good friend, cares deeply about these issues. And one of the things I noticed from his campaign was he had tremendous support among young people. It was astonishing. I mean, it was like, even the most, what I thought would have been the most conservative kids in my classes were Bernie Sanders fans. I couldn't believe it. But one of the things I noticed is when people thought, hey, here's someone who could actually change something, we could actually make this country better. Then there was a real interest in news then. They said, well, what did you read to learn about this? Then they really were hungry for information. And so that the things go hand in hand. If you're in an environment where you think you could be a player and where you're concerned about changing something, then you're hungry to learn more about it. But if you don't think you can do anything about it, you don't want to learn about it, because why torture yourself? I'm just going to learn how powerless I am. I'd rather just watch a football match or have a drink or do something else. And so I think that's the dialectic here. That's the interaction that's going to go on. But we've got to have the information there, so if people get interested, there's something to go to. They think, okay, now I get it. As for politicians' support, I agree. I don't think most politicians, unless they're, you know, unusually principled, and some are, I mean, they're not all bums, but most conventional politicians, you know, who are thinking about their careers, their party, their bank account, this is something that's just sort of a threat to them to a certain extent, because they see it as a way to undermine their power, jeopardize their ability to manipulate how they're perceived in the public. That would be probably a concern. But there are some politicians who do get it. And one of the things that's happened in the United States, I don't know if it's taken place in Europe yet, because our situation is even more severe than Europe, is that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, someone ran for the United States Senate in an American state, which is an important job, and it's a very big election in any state when you're electing one of your two senators. If that person running for Senate from one of the two major parties was traveling around the state, there would have been, depending on the state, anywhere from 5 to 25 or 30 reporters traveling with that candidate, covering every event. And go forward to the 2008, 2010, or to the present day, oftentimes now if a candidate's campaigning, they're traveling by themselves, except with an aide. There aren't any reporters covering campaigns. And politicians realize this, for better and for worse. For worse, it means, let's say a politician has an issue they really care about. They could give a great speech, they could do a paper on it, and it might be something really good. And they don't get any coverage of it. There's no reporters to cover it. So like no one knows about it. And that's frustrating for politicians at the good side. The bad side is, and this is the real pressing issue, if a politician now basically gets paid off on an issue, makes a deal, maybe not an explicit payoff, maybe an explicit payoff, there's no one covering it either. And so it's an open season for corruption, absolutely open season, and we'll never know. The most striking example of this in the United States, from 2000 to 2010, there were 3 huge national political scandals of politicians taking bribes and going to prison. You know, I forget it, but the point is that these were all members of Congress who ended up going to jail for taking bribes from commercial interests who wanted government favors. And the reporters who broke all 3 of those stories were laid off. Their jobs were ended. They no longer exist. So if that same thing had happened between 2010 and after it, those politicians would still be in office. They'd be richer than hell, no time in prison, because there would be no reporters covering them. And so those politicians probably really say, hey, this is the golden age, literally and figuratively. This is the golden age. I can really rake it in now. No one's going to know. And if some website calls me out, I'll call it fake news. And yeah, well, that's his opinion. That's the absurd world we're living in.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I think that we will hear now María Lamuedra from the University of Seville, and then Lorena Romero and Rosalba. I think that Victoria and Gladys, the researcher, the younger researcher, could make their question at the end of this session, because I think that it's taking so long for you, Robert, but at the same time, it's been really interesting. So I think that we can follow this order. María Lamuedra, José Manuel, Lorena, Rosalba, and after them, Gladys, Victoria.
Well, thank you very
Maria?
much. Yes, thank you very much, Aurora, and thank you very much, Robert. It's really a pleasure being here today. I really appreciate, I really have loved both your paper and your lecture. I basically agree with everything. I agree that neoliberalism is tearing apart the social bond, the social fabric. Therefore, we need several things: community cohesion, orientation, information, and also being recognized as citizens. And I think both the local press, local journalism, and public service journalism can do that in the local community and in the national community. So I really see the point there. I also see that it is so necessary that we start seeing that communication and information rights have to be guaranteed, because they are part of an important part in our democratic constitutions. So they must be guaranteed by law or by the mechanism that are necessary. So I really see your point there, asking for subsidies for that. And I really like the initiative. My question, therefore, is how is it going? Who are you going to apply to? Is it in the process of being heard, or are you waiting, we're expecting some answers? And also, can we help somehow? Because I think it would be very, very good for everybody if you really got to do that, and it would be a great reference.
Great questions, and thank you. First of all, look, in the United States, I have to be candid, we're still at the very beginning stages of this. You know, just when we were hoping, our initial plan was, we drew this up in 2019 and 2020, the first version of this was that Trump would lose the presidential election and the Democrat would get elected in the pandemic. And the first thing the Democratic president would do, whoever it would be, they'd have to do a massive stimulus for the economy, which is exactly what happened. And in these huge omnibus bills that everything but the kitchen sink can get put into because they're rushed through and they're for like $2 trillion, we could get this snuck in. That was our plan. Just basically say, hey, this is infrastructure. We need to have a democratic infrastructure to have our society. Journalism's collapsed. Let's get this in. And we were working with that as our hope. The problem came with the pandemic and with the nature of the election. It became clear that doing the groundwork so people knew about it, were familiar with it, and would support it in Washington in particular, it just wasn't possible to do. There were other things, other issues were taking taking claim to people's attention. So since then, we're sort of trying to regroup and get it back in the public domain. I'm doing talks like this. Other people are doing related things. The response is good, but what we ultimately need is legislation to be proposed. It's going to have to be settled at the federal level with a law passed by Congress and signed by the president. And right now, I'm not especially hopeful. The immediate context is not good. It's been disappointing. But I'm not, something can change very quickly. You can't, it's hard to project where this is going to go. We have a few members of the Senate who are enthusiastic about it, and one of them is very influential. But whether they want to devote the time to work on it, put their names on it, and put their resources toward it, right now doesn't look, they've got other stuff on their plate. The issues that facing the country are, they're also the good guys who are worried about the environment and war and peace issues and poverty. So, you know, it's not like they just got time to kill, but that's always the case. So I think that we're making progress, but nowhere near enough and nowhere near as quickly. The good news, I think, in social change, from my experience, both as a scholar and as an activist, is that social change doesn't happen like this in like a slow ramp up and you can see it gradually improving. You sort of are down here and then suddenly there's an explosion and you're up here. But you only get there from all that stuff that was going on before the explosion. And so I think we're still down here, but given the nature of the response the LJI has gotten from just about everyone, because even conservatives, there's nothing in here that would offend a right winger. A fascist wouldn't like it because they just don't like journalism, but a traditional conservative who bemoans the loss of journalism, there's nothing in here that says it's not going to be your journalism, that it won't be journalism you'll respect. So it's got a good reception. I'll give you this is something an anecdote I've told my students in the past, but it's one that's guided me my whole life when it comes to social change, because it's so easy to get depressed and despondent, especially if you're in the United States. And I had a professor in graduate school who was from South Africa. He was a white South African. And he had moved to the United States in the 1960s because he opposed apartheid and didn't want to raise his kids in a country with apartheid. And his wife is Afrikaans. They both moved here. All their families stayed in South Africa. And he was very active in South African politics, even though he lived in the United States and become a US citizen. And in 1988, I just finished my PhD and I was about to move to Madison, Wisconsin for my first job. And I went in to say goodbye to him. He had been on my committee. And I walk in and he's normally a pretty upbeat guy. And he was sort of down in the dumps. And I said, "Hey, Tony, what's wrong? What's up?" And he said, "Well, I just spoke to my brother in South Africa. And he said the political situation there has never been worse. That the ruling Afrikaans party refuses to make any negotiations to get rid of apartheid. They refuse to make any accommodation. And he said, it looks now like the only hope is going to be just a bloody insurrection that'll just fill the streets with blood and might not be successful." It's just very depressing. I told my brother he should just look at his family and leave the country as soon as possible. Now, this is a guy who dedicated his life to overthrowing apartheid. It was his mission, and his brother too. That's how depressed they were. May of 1988. He said it's never been darker. Well, 2 years later, Nelson Mandela is released from Robben Island prison after 30 years in captivity. And with less violence than you'd find in a New Jersey bar fight on a Saturday night, apartheid was rejected, elections were called for, and Nelson Mandela was elected the next president of South Africa a few years after that. That all happened right after he told me it has never been worse. And the moral of the story is you can never anticipate social change. You just can't, it's impossible. Once it happens, all the scholars can line up and say, yeah, see all the factors there? But they were never writing it the day before it happened, saying all the factors are there, it's gonna happen tomorrow. Because if you do that, you're gonna sound like a fool because you're gonna be wrong 99% of the time. No one's gonna pay attention to you. And so we don't know how social change will take place. We can't worry about that in a way. If we think something's important and we believe in it, we have to stay with it. Because in 1988, thank God everyone didn't leave South Africa, because look what happened right after that, to the surprise of everyone in the ANC at that moment. I mean, that was a uniform position. They'd say, it's hopeless. And look what happened, without any violence at all. Extraordinary. So I keep that in mind in issues like this, and we have to. But if you don't do the groundwork now, you're never going to get the explosion. So you just have to operate and hope that the best will happen and be prepared. Do what you can to prepare for that day so it's a good outcome when the explosion happens. We do know one thing, there's going to be a lot of explosions in our lifetimes, no matter what. I mean, we've got environmental and military issues and economic issues that are devastating, and they're going to lead to constant upheaval in our lives. No one here is going to be living a life 30 years from now like they're leading now. We have no idea what it's going to look like. So we have to control, hopefully give it a humane and just outcome.
We will continue with José Manuel Moreno from University of Sevilla. Are you ready, José Manuel?
Yes, I'm here. Oh, thank you, Aurora, for the invitation, and thank you also Robert McChesney, Professor McChesney, because it has been very interesting, the paper and the lecture, and I think it's styling for the current times of journalism, the issue of the paper. I had to be very, very quick. I had two questions or comments that I think are related. The first refers to the role of the public radio and TV network in the United States. The text is not deepened so much, but in some way your position or the position of the paper assume or recognize the failure of this network. And I don't know if you could tell us something more about this, because I think the point of view of the public service in United States and in Europe are different. So it would be good to have more ideas about this. And the second question has to do with the consideration of communication as a public good. I think this is a key of the test. And I find it very interesting when in the paper referred, quoting a text by Elaine Godfrey on a case study in Iowa, that this news desert or witness of local journalists has an economic cost for the local governments linked to the lack of transparency and the increase of corruption. My question is, if you don't think we should extend these studies in order to quantify the cost for the public administration, not to have good local media, just as we measured a few years ago the cost of a smoker for the health policies of another similar examples. This is everything. Thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us.
It's my pleasure. I'd like to move to Spain. You've got a great country, but I can't. I'm moving to Norway. Yeah, your point is so well taken in every regard. The research that should be done, and it hasn't been done yet, but it's starting, on the effects of the loss of journalism economically, on political corruption. Well, everything we see points in the direction that Elaine Godfrey writes about. There's no one yet who said, yeah, well, you lose journalism and boy, things really improve. Health outcomes improve, people live longer, they eat better diets. There's none of that. Everything we see, the lack of local journalism is a disaster. That's exactly what you would expect. The political corruption, cronyism, when there's no journalism, it's open season. So that's the sort of stuff, if we get to the next level in their public hearings, that's the sort of evidence that will be used that really gets people's attention. And people, I mean, I think the Godfrey article that you referred to, what's so nice about that is that I'm a very politically engaged person. I'm living in a city, Madison, Wisconsin, it's not mid-sized, 260,000, 280,000 people in the city. So it's not a large city, but it's not a small town. And it used to have a very good, by American standards, news media culture, 2 daily newspapers for a small town, and a couple of weeklies, and a university town with a lot of people very interested in politics, a rich political history by American standards in this state. And the journalism's all collapsed. It's hardly anything left. I mean, you get the morning paper, it's a joke. So you go read it online, it's still a joke. It's just a digital joke. And you can see it with my kids. My kids who are in their 20s, the youngest is in her 20s, and she's lived here. I mean, she and her friends know nothing about anything in this community except what they get on social media about some concert or something. But they're utterly clueless about who their member of Congress is, what the issues are, what's going on in this community outside of the sensational stuff that she might grab on social media. And it's striking. And it is a huge loss. Now, she's a great kid. She has great values. And she's not a jerk by any means, but she just doesn't have any command of her community. And I think what you see, the worst part of that is it produces a sort of a depression. Human beings are social creatures. I mean, our quality of our lives is dependent upon having other people we interact with that makes us happier, healthier. That's what humans are. We're social. We don't exist without a social environment. And when you don't have local journalism, that just deteriorates. Suddenly, the person down the street you don't know, and they're like, hey, they're a little weird. I don't deal with that. What's that guy? Instead of being, oh yeah, I read about the guy in the paper. You know, he just came back from Brazil where he was building a hut for some family. Now that's really interesting. You know, there's that connection you lose, and it leads, I think, ultimately to depression among people and unhappiness. Oh, as for your question on Spanish TV and radio, yeah. You know, that's become a real growth industry. It's largely controlled by the big media conglomerates. And so it looks much like English language, as far as I can tell what I've seen, radio and television. I think what I said about African Americans and the local journalism initiative would also apply to Latino communities, especially recent immigrant communities. Now, I suspect you all know this, but I'll say it in the remote chance some of you don't. There's a very large first and second generation Latino community in the United States coming overwhelmingly from Central America and Mexico, and then decreasingly from South America, the further you get away from the United States, but mostly from Venezuela, Colombia, straight on up through Mexico, and clearly the Caribbean to Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, and Cuba to a certain extent. So this huge Latin population. It is also in about half the country, the Southwest, even into the Midwest, and large parts of the country, it's a big chunk of the working class now. I mean, if you're going to see people doing the work in this country, they're Latinos often, and they're oftentimes speak Spanish. And it's their native language, and they live in a Spanish-speaking community. Their kids learn English, they don't speak it. Well, this would be an opportunity, especially in areas with a significant Latino population, where at LJI, in Spanish even, or certainly Spanish and English, representing the interests of first-generation workers, first and second-generation Latino communities from Central America, would have the resources to have a really good news media that would serve their interests, answer the questions they're concerned about. Every bit as much as the African American community. So I think that would be a plus, a great plus.
Thank you. We are going to finish the academic discussion with Professor Lorena Romero from the University of Seville. If you are ready, Lorena.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Professor Labio, for inviting me to join this session. I am really pleased to have the chance to share this time with other colleagues and to discuss with one of the most prominent authors in the field of political economy of communication. Thank you very much, Professor McChesney, for your interesting conference and for your inspiring work. I will try to be brief because I think it has been really intense for all of us and also for Professor McChesney. And as far as I can see, after reading your proposed paper, Professor McChesney, you are really confident that philanthropists can promote and support free, quality, and healthy journalism, and build a more viable non-commercial system. However, some works have pointed out several ways in which donors may affect editorial content, rules, and values in news organization. Researchers suggest that foundation funding might result in pressures on journalists to avoid certain topics, or maybe to adopt the interpretative frames of their funders. They agree that this funding constrains journalism by promoting self-censorship when there is a clear correlation between the subject being funded and the donor's interest. Regarding this thesis, I would like to ask you if the Local Journalism Sustainability Initiative envisages implementing strategies to fight against influence of foundations, public or private, it's equal, on media organizations. There have been some examples, as you may know, for example, the document, The Ethical Terrain of Nonprofit Journalism by the American Press Institute. But after 5 years of its publication, it seems that much work remains to be done to stop subordinating the journalistic agenda to those who pay the bills. I am really concerned about philanthropic capitalists because I think it may enable powerful business people. You mentioned in your paper, I think it's Stewart Bynum. Stewart Bynum is a businessman and also a politician. But I think it can enable these people. We can mention also Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or George Soros Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, or Hewlett Packard Foundation, whatever. I think it can exercise editorial influence and limiting journalists' perceptions of legitimate controversy in the public sphere. I will appreciate so much your opinion on this topic, how we can stop the future influence of these donors in journalism. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. You know, in the United States, we have a great tradition of philanthropy with foundations. I think more than most countries, wealthy people put their, especially really wealthy people, put their money in these foundations, and then for generations, the income of the investments is given to groups for charitable purposes. And it's a lot of money. I mean, if you put the total combined wealth of our 100 largest foundations, we're talking trillions of dollars that's generated income. So it's a lot of money. But as much as it is, it's not enough to cover journalism in the United States. Even if you thought these were run by the most pristine, perfect humans on earth, that we could trust them, there's not enough. We've seen already there's just not enough money in the philanthropic community to pay for journalism and also do everything else they want to do. So it just, as a practical matter, it's not a solution to the crisis of journalism. But then the second point is, it's not necessarily a desirable solution, even if it was a solution, because all money has strings attached, no matter where it comes from. Money talks. So if the money's coming from a billionaire like Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, you know, the people at the Washington Post all sort of know, okay, he's got an agenda, maybe, you know, keep that in mind as we do our job. He has influence because he owns it. If you're supported by advertisers, and you know that certain types of industries are huge supporters, advertisers, probably the nature of the coverage isn't going to be very critical of that industry. That's the pattern. You would expect that. And philanthropies have their own agenda too, depending on whose philanthropy it is. It might be a political agenda, it might be an issue agenda, but they're giving you money for a reason, not just writing a check and turning around and saying, do whatever you want. And that's why the LJI only has money coming from the public, as it does, controlled by these votes. So there's no mystery. Well, what's the real agenda of this group? Is there a political party behind it that controls it? Is there a politician? Is there a business? Is there a capitalist? No, it's all up front, all the money. It's a lot of money, but it's enough so they don't have to have other sources of funds, and you can trust it. That's that. And in philanthropy, as far as the role they can play, if philanthropy wants to contribute money to start one of these groups so they can get off the ground, fine. And I think they'd be happy with that. Then they can get out of the way. You know, they might say, we'll fund you for 1 year, and then you go to the election. If you get support, you can stay in business on your own. But they can't control one of these groups that's also getting public money. And I think I think most philanthropists are very happy with that. The bigger concern would be the people like Jeff Bezos or the late Sheldon Adelson, billionaires who buy up these newspapers just to use them as propaganda rags for their usually right-wing, but not always, politics. And that's sort of a concern. They can still do that if they want, but they won't be able to buy a megaphone to control an entire community's journalism if there are other people doing journalism too, like from the LJI. But that's even not too big of a problem. Billionaires don't want to torch their money that badly, and that you're torching your money if you're trying to support a daily newspaper in this economy.
Thank you. The last two questions come from researchers, Victoria Garcia Prieto and Gladys Arlett. So if they are ready, for instance, Victoria, could you start with the first question?
Yes, of course. First, I'd like to say thank you to Professor Labio and to all the participants, and of course to Professor McChesney. And I'll try to be very brief. We're here talking about local, independent, free, healthy journalism, but at the same time, for example, Elon Musk is investing in the metaverse. So I wonder how we can combine these two realities, because we're not talking about platforms like Netflix or social media anymore, but about other new realities that at first glance, at least in my view, seem to take us even farther away from local media. So how can these realities be combined? Thank you.
Can I ask you to follow up? I missed what the second reality is that you were, I didn't, when you just, what is that?
Yes, it's the metaverse.
Oh, metaverse, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I don't have the answer for it. I don't know enough about the metaverse at this point in time. You know, but I think you're raising a really important issue, and I think your analysis of it is probably the analysis I would have, the way you framed it, if I knew more. But anything I said now would just reveal my total ignorance. But I think skepticism is a very wise course. When the metaverse is being built by someone, by a firm that firms that view it as a way to get very rich, it's not a very good recipe for a successful outcome for the human race.
Okay, and the last question, please, Gladys, is you are ready?
I'm ready, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Aurora, and thank you so much, Professor Robert McChesney. My name is Gladys, I am Mexican, and currently I'm studying the PhD in communication at the University of Seville. And first of all, I want to thank you for letting us know your work. And I want to ask you a very simple question. How to get involved the young people into reading news? Because I have friends that are professors here in Spain and also in Mexico, and they told me all the time, Gladys, my students, they don't like to read news even on the newspaper or even in online newspapers. And I think right now they are new different consumption sources, because they told me that they like to consume news in YouTube or listening to podcasts, and even they like to listen to YouTubers giving reviews about news. I found that very interesting. Also, I want to point out a very quick example. In the Ukraine situation framework, in Mexico, there is a YouTuber. He basically bought a plane ticket to Ukraine, and he broadcast with his cell phone what is happening in Ukraine. There was a lot of reviews and a lot of people that start following him, because they say, and I found this very interesting, they say that, okay, he's not a journalist, and he doesn't belong to any media, to any TV channel, or even to any party. So I want to know how he's broadcasting the news, and I found it very interesting. So I'm going to come back to the start, how to get involved young people into reading news. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for this. We've sort of talked about that a little bit because it is a recurring issue for anyone who teaches for a living, because you're dealing with young people constantly. And some of us, well, all of us were young once. And, I don't have anything more to say, pretty much some of what I've said, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that my sense is always when people sense there's something in the world that it's important to them and they can do something about it, then there'll be a strong interest in learning about it and getting involved. And that sort of is how it works. I will say it's sort of striking, and it shows, I think, sort of the cynicism and, the sadness in a way of our times, that they say, I like this person with their cell phone going there who really doesn't necessarily know anything about this country, know anything about why the war is taking place, have any idea about anything. But because of that, I could trust them because they're just going to hold their phone up and walk around. And that's all I need to know. That is a frightening proposition. So yeah, hopefully someone will say, oh, you don't know shit. If you think that's knowing anything, you're a moron. I mean, I think that would be my response.
Okay, thank you.
On that gracious note, we can end.
If nobody has anything that would like to add, or we are now out of time, I think that we will conclude this enlightening section with Professor McChesney. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We hope to be able to welcome you in person to our university sometime in the future. And thanks to everyone present for taking part in our discussion. Thank you. And see you.
Thank all of you. Comments, questions were great. You all look like wonderful people. I'm glad we're members of the same species.
Well, I think we don't speak different language, as you said at the beginning. It is very easy to understand you, and I think we have connect with your words. So in one sense, we speak the same language.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you all very much, and have a great day, great week.